Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
that looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
For something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. The most common narrative of the current conflict in the Middle East is that it pits Muslims and Jews against each other. It suggests differences in those two religions, and the expectations inherent in those faiths makes finding common ground impossible. But are differences in faith really at the center of the conflict? We'll ask three faith leaders from Christianity, Islam, and Judaism for their assessment, the impact the conflict has had on them and their communities, and whether finding common ground might be possible. So we are very fortunate this morning to have three familiar faces on Challenge, three interfaith friends representing the three major faith traditions. We have Pastor Dave Brown, Rabbi Olivier Ben Chaim, and Imam Jamal Rahman. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's begin at the beginning of what has been a very unfortunate, to use a minimally appropriate term, period of our history, world history, and that is, how did each of you hear about the October 7th attack on the Israeli soil? And Olivier, I understand that particularly came at a transitional time for you because you were literally leaving the United States to go visit friends and family, both in Europe and I believe the Middle East. Can you tell us how you ended up becoming aware of the situation and what had happened over there?
Well, I first heard of it. One of our members, on Friday night, we were having our worship service at the synagogue, and one of our members at the end of the service just briefly said to me, "Oh, I just heard that something is happening in Israel and Gaza." And in the back of my mind, I went, "Oh no, here we go again," because I had, we've been kind of trained to have these, flare-ups in the conflict and Hamas firing rockets over Israel, and in my mind, I thought, here's another repeat of that. So I was concerned, but I went home not really thinking anything major had happened. And then over the course of the next day, over the course of the Sabbath, we started hearing more of what had transpired and the tragedy that was unfolding there, that had unfolded there. By the evening of that day was another Jewish holiday, actually, the holiday of Simchat Torah. That is the holiday that comes to close the high holidays, which is a month-long series of celebrations. And so I was really, as I was listening to what was going on, and the numbers started to come in, 100, 200, and then we heard several more hundreds of Israelis that had been massacred. I even wondered if it would have been, if it could be appropriate to hold the celebration that night. But in emailing some of our members and the board of directors, we decided to go forward. And so we came together, had a celebration as best we could, while also in our heart holding what was unfolding in Israel. And then not only that, yes, I had to leave the next day for a family travels to Europe. It was really an earthquake in the Jewish communities, in the Jewish world.
And Dave and Jamal, what are your recollections of when you first heard about the October 7th aspect of this? Dave?
I'm certain that we first heard it watching the news, and my mind went in several different directions. One with shadows of what's happening in Ukraine, and now an act of violence here. I started to realize that there is a real sense, to use a cliche, that the world is on fire, that there just seems to be emerging global tensions and trying to understand how do we speak a word of understanding and peace in the midst of that. And I just fell back into my own spiritual pondering about what it means to follow the way of Jesus, which I believe is a way of peace and nonviolence in such a broken world, and what is the best way that I can stand with the people I love in the Jewish community in particular, like my brother that's sitting to my side here.
And Jamal, how did you happen to hear about it on October 7th, and what was your initial reaction then?
You know, Jeff, I'm a bit of a news junkie. So I heard about it pretty early on, and then I followed it very closely. And my first reaction was disbelief. This cannot be. I'm familiar with, my father was a Middle Eastern expert. I'm familiar with Shin Bet, Mossad, Israel Defense Forces. And how could that fortifications be breached? Not possible. And then, again, another shock and disbelief. It took 6-7 hours for the first response to come. So my disbelief deepened even more. This cannot be true. And of course, as time went on and we heard about the carnage, then of course, doesn't matter what one's tribal affiliations are, whatever one's political stance is, this is immoral, this is unacceptable, and we have to state the truth. So it was a carnage, and it is certainly a blight upon what humanity is capable of.
So I might repeat our opening question in terms of the response in Gaza. And again, the question would be, what went through each of your minds and hearts? And Jamal, I might begin with you and then proceed.
See, I say just as it is immoral, unacceptable what Hamas did, I believe what the Israeli Defense Forces are doing in their excessive, what President Biden calls over the top, is also immoral and unacceptable. But I want to say that what the danger is that when there is prolonged violence, prolonged anger, despair, sadness, then the Quran says it's not that the eyes become blind, the hearts become blind. And that is what gives rise to extremism. Whether it's on the Israeli side or the Palestinian side, hearts have become blind, and you'll have extremism now. Just as, for example, Taliban, we're familiar with that, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas. What gave birth to that? The prolonged anger, despair, and then this bloodletting violence. So what went through my mind is, oh my goodness, now for generations, you will have extremism born on both sides.
Olivier, what about your initial impressions when you heard about the response in Gaza then?
When I saw what had happened on October 7th and when the news became clear, Israel's response in Gaza happened some 2 weeks later. So by then we had a little bit of a clearer picture of what had unfolded and on that day. I thought my initial response was that Israel had to respond, that there was no way that Israel was going to sit on its hands and try to figure out maybe a diplomatic solution to this. I think it was such a visceral attack. It was so violent. It was so horrendous that my first reaction was that Israel will have to go after Hamas. There was just no other option that I could be with. I could foresee, in those moments. And I have a lot of friends in Israel that are on both sides of the political spectrum. And I think Israel was completely united in that moment. And I know friends who just pick up their bags and don their uniforms and just went without even waiting for the army to call. Because there was this sense of we need to respond. There is a sense of solidarity with the people, between the people. And so, I think there is still clarity in Israel around. We need to remove the Hamas from Gaza, and I think that's what they're going to keep on doing until that is achieved. I think after 9/11 here, when 3,000 Americans were murdered by radical Islam, there was a great sense of outrage, and a lot of very powerful people said a lot of very extremist things in reaction to the violence that was done to America. The Israeli equivalent on October 7th would have been the violent murder of about 60,000 Americans, if you were to if we were to draw parallels. I don't imagine that Netanyahu have said beyond going after Hamas and eradicating and eliminating the Hamas from Gaza that Israel was going to go after the Palestinian people. I don't think that was part of his rhetoric, and we know him to be an extremist. But I just want to make sure that it's not mentioned that Israel decided to go and eradicate the Palestinian people. Quite the opposite. They are really very specifically going after a terror organization that has brought war to its shore, and in my estimation has also been detrimental to the Palestinian people in Gaza by fostering an authoritarian regime there, and preventing them from having the life of freedom that they deserve.
And if I may just add to that, if we say what October 7th Hamas did was immoral, unacceptable, we have to speak the truth. It is absolutely true. What the IDF forces are doing in Gaza is now revenge. That is also immoral and unacceptable. We have to also say that the occupation for decades is also immoral and unacceptable. So we have to speak the truth on all of these circumstances.
The truth is also that Israel was not occupying Gaza for the last 20 years.
Yeah, but it was an open-air prison. The whole world knows that.
I think we can discuss that.
Yeah.
And this is where, when our faith comes in and counters some of our political human instincts. I was in New York and watched 9/11 happen. I literally had the smoke of those buildings in my eyes. And my heart was broken and I was angry, but I was more afraid of what revenge America was going to want to take than I was wanting revenge. If somebody makes you blind and you blind them back, or you have a bunch of people who can't see. And my faith looks at the brokenness of the world and doesn't seek revenge, even though I realize that's part of the political reality. And the challenge is how to have a voice that resonates with this world where revenge is a norm, and encourage people to step back and think about how can we get beyond the cycle of I'm going to hit you, you're going to hit me, I'm going to hit you back, until we're all just bruised.
As we look back over the history of the Middle East, and each of you are far better acquainted with that than I am, the conflict has largely been portrayed as that between Islam and Judaism. Is that accurate, or have we seen the so-called voice of faith and the faith response basically sidelined and monopolized by certain elements that aren't really representative of their individual communities?
What I'm sharing, what I'm seeing from all the documents that have been made historically available is that really this was from the beginning a dispute over land. It was not a religious conflict to begin with in its inception. My sense is that in those past years and maybe a couple decades, groups like the Hamas, who are religious in their outlook, have tried to actually shift the paradigm to be a religious conflict. But at its core, it's fundamentally a conflict over land.
I totally agree. You see, Islam and Judaism have a lot in common. In fact, more in common with Islam with Judaism than with Christianity. It's the same Abrahamic family, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but as we always say, it's a very, very dysfunctional Abrahamic family. Muslims and Jews, there have been tensions in the course of history, but by and large they have coexisted. They even had a golden age until it became a political issue, you said, the fight over land. And that, goes to point out that this is not religion speaking, the dispute. This is our ego speaking. Our angry ego, our wounded ego. So what's a good place to start? I and my Interfaith Amigos, we've been to Israel and Palestine twice. And what impressed me most was a group of rabbis and imams talking, but starting with one premise. They said, let's start with this one particular common mutual understanding. This land we are fighting over does not belong to the Jews. It does not belong to the Muslims. It does not belong to the Christians. It belongs to God. Let's start with that. Those are groups that give me a lot of hope.
You've sort of mentioned land, and I guess I'm also wondering how much of this and the leadership on all sides have very little to do with their adherence to faith, but politics in terms of trying to posture and get the most advantage for their groups. What are your perceptions on all of that?
I've been thinking more and more about Friedrich Nietzsche, and he believes that it all distills down to the will to power. And as in my faith, I see it should all be boiling down to the will to love.
I think there's a lot of fear at the root of this conflict. A lot of fear, and if we're talking about land as the core that originated the conflict, I think that the fear of losing land, the fear of being displaced, the fear of the other taking everything over. I mean, it's still playing out. It's still playing out in the rhetoric right now. Palestine will be free. That means that the whole, again, it's about who is on the land and who is no longer on the land. And so that fear of, oh my God, they're going to take everything from me, right, has really been fueling this conflict from the beginning, really from the beginning.
I would say any conflict, personal or collective war, is rooted in the base elements or the vile elements of the ego. Could be fear, could be greed, could be anger. And when that happens, for me, the biggest problem is this. When that happens, we do not connect with the other on a human level. Number one. And number two, we begin to judge an entire culture, an entire religion, an entire race by the behavior of some people. And then what happens is, it becomes easy for me under those circumstances to demonize and dehumanize the other. That to me is a big problem. So the key is really, how can we get to know the other on a human level? So all these problems in the Middle East, what is important is at this time, I refuse to surrender my humanity and work with Olivier, work with Dave, for us to really get to know one another, talk about our differences, talk about the elephant in the room. That way, we might still have differences, but it'll be difficult to demonize the other.
Are there groups in the region, and I know there have been in the past, Paths to Understanding, Tracy Levine Camp brought people from both backgrounds together, but are there groups even now that are reaching out to each other to try to provide, at least on a small scale, an alternative approach to the differences?
Many groups, many groups, and that's what gives me hope, actually. Just one example, which we've talked about a lot. When I've been to Israel, Palestine, Israeli parents who have lost their children because of the Palestinian attacks, Palestinian parents who have lost their children because of the Israeli Defense Forces, when they get together and talk, that's a very genuine conversation. That's just one example. There are thousands and thousands of grassroots level organizations that say, as I said earlier, they refuse to surrender their humanity. like that wonderful columnist Christoph said, if my moral compass is attuned to the suffering of only one side, then my moral compass is broken, and so is my humanity. Thank God there are people like that, Jewish friends, Muslim friends, and they get together and talk. And those grassroots levels, I think, when they join forces over time, they can create a huge avalanche that can really overcome all kinds of problems. I'll end by saying, in my lifetime, I never thought apartheid would crumble.
Mm-hmm.
Berlin Wall would come down. Communism would dissolve. An African American would be elected 2 terms in the White House. It didn't happen suddenly. There were these kind of grassroots level organizations doing this work on both sides.
I completely agree with Brother Jamal. There is dozens and dozens of organizations on many different parts of Israeli and Palestinian societies that come together. I love this group that Brother Jamal was talking about. In my tours of Israel, we went and visited, for example, a women's empowerment group as well that brings together women from the West Bank together with Israeli women, and they try to support each other in developing some micro businesses in order to empower women to have to help on both sides, to help women have a greater voice and a greater presence, and hopefully to change the political space in both their communities. There are religious groups that are coming together, imams, Christian clergy, Jewish clergy in Jerusalem. I mean, I get their emails. They're very involved right now. They're very active. They're continuing their work. It's more critical than ever. The massacres that happened on October 7th, the Israelis that were murdered actually were peace activists. The music festival that was happening in the Negev was raising funds for peace. Mm-hmm. That's what they were there for. They had a dance for that, but that's what they were there for. The people in those kibbutz, these farms outside of Gaza, they employ people from Gaza. They try to support families in Gaza. They have connections. They are very much peace activists, mm-hmm. and they do it on the ground. They're doing tangibly, and that's continued. That's not going to stop on either as part of what's unfolding now. It's even strengthened, I think, in Israel as well. I can't speak of the Palestinian side, but I know in Israel it's very strong and continues to be.
What would you recommend could or should be done? What would your suggestions be?
I would say engage with those who are really working so hard at the grassroots level, mm-hmm. to reconcile the two groups. And whether it's Israeli or the Palestinian, I mean, I'll be very honest with you, they're both very noble people. Mm-hmm. They both have profound causes. We can go as far back into time as possible. So I can say, let me focus on pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. The wise thing is to focus and work with those groups that are working relentlessly to bring these two cousins together. Mm-hmm. And they exist.
Actually, yes. In this schematic of either pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian, I would say there's a third alternative, which is aligned with what Brother Jamal was just sharing. It's like be pro-peace. Mm-hmm. I think that's where my heart is leading me. That's where my efforts are going towards. And being pro-peace means to work toward a free, independent state of Palestine alongside a secure state of Israel. Mm-hmm. Being pro-peace is supporting those groups on the ground that are doing the hard work against very, very difficult odds, and to help them with our finances, to help them with going there, to help them and see what do you need, mm-hmm. because they are the ones who are going to make a difference. We can wave our flags on the campus of Harvard. That's not helping the people that are actually right there on the ground suffering and dying and being wounded and being hurt. So my sense is, let's work to support those who are working pro-peace and be pro-peace. Let's not support the radical right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu. Let's not support Hamas and its terror organization. Let's support those who want, actually the overwhelming majority, I believe on both sides, they want to live like the life we have. You know, they want to live in security. They want to go about their business. They want to be able to love and grow children and families. It's so I get a little bit involved in this.
That's good.
But
And let's use
the third alternative is be pro peace.
and let's use language that helps people see the subtleties. Big generalizations of this or that does not help solve the problem. It is lots of subtle pieces.
I would like to thank each of you. So often we hear the extremes, and I don't think people can even conceive very often watching that, how three people from different faith traditions, leaders in those traditions, and beyond that, sitting down and having the discussion that we just had, that optimally we could go much longer and in greater depth, but I'd like to thank each of you for this and on your work on behalf of that. And I would just say to our audience, when you hear these headlines, when you see the news coverage, think of what you've just seen here and represent that in front of the one reality or the portrayal of reality you see on the camera, there's this other reality that exists. So I thank you very much for tuning into this episode of Challenge 2.0 and hope you'll join us again next week. Thank you.